Okay, so before we get started, good morning and good afternoon, everybody.
Buenas tardes.
You'll see on
Oh,
your screen there is interpretation that will be available in French and in Spanish. And so we're going to put the setting on there so that you can access that. I'm going to let the interpreters come on and share what I just said, and then we'll move into the webinar itself.
bienvenidos. Tenemos interpretación inglés a español. El seminario web iniciará en breve. Si les gustaría a ustedes acceder a la interpretación simultánea, estará en inglés y en español. Por favor, clic en el icono del mundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Puede escoger el canal del idioma que les gustaría escuchar.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes, c'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous. L'option d'interprétation sera disponible pour l'ensemble de ce webinaire. Veuillez s'il vous plaît cliquer sur l'icône permettant de choisir la langue française.
Great, so we should have the interpretation available now. You should be able to press on. And so I will move on to the start of our webinar, if that's good. Aoife, do you want to? Okay. Great. Okay, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. Welcome to the webinar for the launch of the results-based prevention evaluation framework for gender-based violence prevention. We're very excited about this initiative and the launch. To introduce myself, my name is Jessica Lenz. I am the Senior Advisor for Protection at Interaction, and I lead the work on results-based protection and have been overseeing the work on the development of the framework as well. So we are very excited and also want to share a little bit about the background for the framework itself and how it came about before we turn it over to our main presenter today, who will actually present on the framework. So a bit of background: this was an initiative that started 2 years ago. It's funded by the Swedish government from SIDA, and it has been going on for 2 years, and it's led by an advisory committee made up of 15 different organizations. And it's quite diverse. It includes some universities, some different NGOs, as well as ICRC, and also has 4 experts that sit on the steering group that help make decisions around the scope and the direction that the framework has been moving in. The overarching purpose and the objective for why we decided that we needed to develop this was to develop a set of guiding approaches and strategies aimed at helping practitioners make better decisions in their analysis, program design, and measurement, so GBV prevention outcomes can ultimately be measured. So the objective really is to improve the evidence base for GBV prevention. So you'll see that although this is called a framework for evaluation, in order to evaluate, it's essential that we actually look at every aspect of analysis, program design, and measurement in order to be able to actually achieve GBV outcomes. The intended user for this framework is very much focused at the field. So it's field-based practitioners, and that includes whether it's GBV program managers or advisors, but also other program managers and generalists from other sectors. And it also includes, it focuses on meal teams and M&E teams as well. And this is essential because as you see, as we introduce the framework, you'll see how critical it is that both program teams and meal teams work together in thinking about analysis, design, and measurement for GBV, and ultimately to be able to achieve an outcome. Before we actually started to develop the framework, we actually undertook a scoping study in 2019, really to help us understand and map out how organizations were addressing GBV, how they understood GBV risk patterns, what types of methods they were using for design as well as evaluation. And this, you can go to the next slide. this study was released at the end of the year in 2019, so it is available on Interaction's website. So I'm not going to go into full detail, but I just wanted to give a little bit of some of the background so that you're familiar with really why we then pushed forward to develop this framework. And I think the overarching finding from the scoping study was that the majority of programs that are focused on GBV prevention were just not evaluable. And what we mean by that is that as you start to dig in to be able to evaluate an outcome, it's so essential from the very beginning that you actually understand the problem that you're trying to address. And in the scoping study, what we found is that many times there was quite a weak context-specific analysis of GBV. GBV was often generalized into this broad category, but not really diving in deeper to understand the specific patterns of different types of GBV risk. And that really led to very unclear program designs then. So if you're not analyzing the problem well, then your programs or your projects are designed in a more generalist way and not very specific in order to be able to ultimately achieve the outcome that you're aiming for. And with those program designs, we found often lacking any type of context-specific theory of change that underpinned the choices that were being made around the activities and the target groups. There were sometimes global theories of change for some organizations that were used, but oftentimes nothing very context-specific. And this is essential as you'll start to hear more and more about why we need to have this in order to measure outcomes. At the same time, we saw quite underdeveloped articulation of the intended outcomes. We saw missing, baseline data, difficulties in disaggregating information to really understand the different vulnerabilities or the threats that were arising for GBV. And because of this, what we did see was an emphasis on risk mitigation and safe programming. And that's not a bad thing. And especially with all of the work that's been done with the GBV guidelines and the rollout of that. But we did see, because there's emphasis there was quite a neglect around the focus on GBV prevention more broadly. And there was much interest, but very little being done to actually look at programming for GBV prevention. So next slide. So we, after the study, it was concluded that we really needed an evaluation framework that would really help organizations ensure that their programs and interventions were fit for purpose, and that what we were able to provide in the framework would enable organizations to understand whether their programs were evaluable. So what does that actually mean, and what does that mean for GBV? And then lastly, we identified that there was quite a lot of interest in trying out new methods and approaches for measuring outcomes for GBV. Instead of typical ways of M&E, which tend to then focus mostly on measuring the outputs of our projects, what types of methods could we use in a conflict situation around a very complex issue that would actually help us understand the outcomes we were aiming to achieve. So that's really what we realized the framework needed to focus and aim around. Next slide. So how did we go about building this? Aside from a ton of bilateral conversations and focus groups across the globe, we also undertook 8 virtual field workshops. COVID hit right at the time that we were going to be going to the field, so they became virtual. And this was across 6 different country contexts. And they were week-long workshops with program teams, including GBV experts, as well as the meal team. Sometimes country directors participated as well. Very interactive and engaging. And it allowed us to be able to explore some of the challenges and the opportunities and really understand how organizations were trying to address GBV prevention. And so you can see by this chart some of the country contexts that we were in, as well as the issues and the program types that organizations were focusing on. So sometimes we were looking at awareness raising initiatives or safe spaces or socioeconomic support. So a quite diverse array of different activities. And that really helped us then hone in on what were some of the commonalities, but then also what were the challenges that we saw in some of these unique situations that we would need to address within the GBV framework. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into this slide in detail because I'd rather, I think this is really going to come out in our panelist discussion, but I just wanted to say that there were quite a lot of findings around project design and measurement that really helped them frame the way that we designed and developed the evaluation framework. So everything from really thinking about the fact that we don't have very good project design, and a lot of time that's because we have pressure, we have limited time to actually work on things, 2 to 4 weeks sometimes, when a call for proposal goes out and we have to get a proposal in. And with that, that limits our ability to engage with populations, to ensure that it's being informed and that it's participatory, as well as, a lot of issues that came out around GBV, whether it's do no harm principles or data protection. Many of these issues that start to come out of the field level workshops will resonate with many of you, but this is what we used as a way to ensure that the framework really spoke to GBV and spoke to conflict situations, and how we could ensure that the methods that we are introducing were going to be fit for purpose and actually be able to be practical enough to be able to use. So without further delay, I would actually like to move to the next slide and introduce our colleague Neil Dillon, who is the director of Data Conscious. He and his team were the ones that led the development of the framework itself, and he's going to introduce the framework in all of its parts. And I just want to say, one, I wanted to say, some of you may be familiar with Neil. He used to work with AllNap. He's an expert in M&E, and he's fabulous to work with. And his team also included GBV advisor, Francisco Vigo Walsh. So both of them, their team together really were able to think about this in a very practical way for all of you. Again, we're introducing the framework. It hasn't been piloted yet, but we will talk about what that's going to look like after this presentation. So over to you, Neil, to talk about the specifics.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also for the pleasure of working on this project, because it was an intensely difficult project because of the nature of the challenges that you're looking at when it comes to GBV prevention, but a really fascinating one. So what I'm going to try and do is walk through some of the highlights of what's in the framework. It's quite a large piece, the framework itself, and I'll walk through the main elements of it, but I won't be able to go into the full details in the short space of time that we have here. So what I would say is, if you've got any particular questions about particular tools or particular approaches, I'd be happy to address that afterwards through the panel, or even afterwards through follow-up communications. Just before we move on, Ife, just to highlight that it was a team effort. So I myself was leading the team, but we also had Francisca Vigo Walsh, who has a long-standing history in the GBV sector, and Julius Nyangaga as well, who is an outcome mapping expert, which provided some very specific technical expertise for the framework. We also had Ines Sianchek, who was a fantastic project coordinator, given a number of workshops that Jessica has just walked through. I'm sure you can imagine that her support was invaluable. So Ife, if you could move on to the next slide for me, that would be fantastic, and we could start to look at what it actually looks like. So if I were to give you a one-word description of what it looks like, the answer is modular. We are looking at a framework that we want program teams who are deep in the field working on GBV prevention with specific communities, as well as GBV coordinators at country office level, and M&E and meal specialists, and even headquarters teams. We want all of these people to be able to make use of this framework. So as a result, we felt the need to make it quite modular so that people can dip in and dip out a bit as per their needs for their organization, but also for their specific function within their organization. And the last point there is that we are looking to make this as broad as possible, because we understand that many different organizations have different perspectives and histories of engagement on GBV. And so again, we want to try and make this useful across the board. And as a result, it's not the kind of thing you necessarily need to read the whole thing through, but we do have lots of different elements that are useful sort of to tie together. So what we've done is we've broken it down into 4 different modules. The first one is on risk analysis, where really we're asking this question of, or trying to answer the question of, how you can build more context-specific GBV risk analyses. So we're not talking here about a globalized understanding of what might cause certain types of GBV for certain types of vulnerable groups. What we're doing is looking at the community level that you're working with in your operational context. What risks are they facing, and what risks disaggregated across different groups in the community are being faced? And we tried to build a way, as we'll come on to sort of build a rich picture there, to not just say this type of risk is faced, but these are the types of threats, these are the vulnerabilities, and these are the community capacities to respond. So to build out that picture, but to keep it at very, very context-specific level. Module 2 looks at how you design a program on the back of that. So here we're really focusing in on program design, and by which I'm not talking about human resources or financing, I'm talking about the way we build the theory of change behind the program, how we understand the activities that we're designing to tackle the risk that we've got in that first module, the one that we've analyzed. And then on module 3, we're looking at measurement considerations that you need to take into account right at project design stage. So these are the kinds of things that we think once you've got a good risk analysis and once you've got a good theory of change, if you take these considerations into account, your project will be evaluable and will have overcome that kind of core problem that Jessica was noting from the scoping study. So these are things that you need to consider when building a monitoring framework, or to think about the way that your program team and your M&E team will work together to collect data, to analyze, to aggregate, kind of some of the basic ethical questions about data collection as well. The sort of core things you need to think about at the start before you do the measurement itself. Once those are in place, you should have a program that's up and running and that is actually collecting data that's of use to your project teams. And that's when module 4 comes in, which is a selection of tools. It really is a selection. We're not advocating the use of one tool over others. We're saying fit this around your program and your project context. So here what we've done is selected evaluation approaches that are particularly good at exploring unintended consequences and unpicking some of the sort of wider impacts that you get when it comes to looking at something like GBV prevention, and also tools that can help you explore things from the perspective of the communities themselves rather than just from the program team's perspective. So moving on to the next slide, Ife, I'm just going to talk through a few of the highlights of those different aspects now. So if you click on again, we can move on to module 1 on the risk analysis, and straight through again, Ife, there's a lot of highlight slides here. So on the risk analysis module, we were really looking at the use of the risk equation to try and build a stronger risk analysis at context specific level. So what do we mean by that? What we're talking about is guiding teams through the kinds of questions that we think they should be asking to help build the context specificity of their understanding of the GBV risks and the risk patterns in the communities they're working in. So the kinds of questions you've got there are on the screen. There's a lot more to it than that, but this is just a sort of a brief summary. So we're thinking that we want organizations to be asking the basic question of what types of GBV are individuals faced with in a particular crisis, but also then to look at the types of threat, the types of perpetrator that are committing those GBV acts or threatening to, but then to go beyond that and to really think through who's more likely to face these particular types of threats. So rather than just thinking about vulnerability as a category, like you belong to a category of vulnerable people, instead thinking what makes you vulnerable to this particular threat. So linking the analysis of the threat and the vulnerability together on a context-specific basis. And then lastly, thinking about the capacities that the community already has in place to try and mitigate those GBV risks and how they can be bolstered. The last point that we've kind of put in there is a look at the underlying factors. And I know that different organizations approach some of the underlying factors in different ways. And there is a question here about the role of humanitarian aid in working on this kind of stuff. But really, I think there's some useful stuff to look at there when it comes to just understanding the types of factors that community members themselves think underlie the risks that they're facing, and how they're related to pre-existing practices, beliefs or norms, or perhaps they're related to short-term, much more short-term features like there might be a crisis itself that could induce food insecurity or reduce physical security, or health crisis or displacement factors that might exacerbate some of those GBV risks. So just looking at some of those underlying factors with a view to not just thinking about long-term developmental changes, but also thinking about short-term triggers that can exacerbate pre-existing risks. So if you could move on to the next slide, Ife, what we've got here is just a example. I don't have time to go through full detail, but it's also very detailed. It's an example of what we've got in the framework, which is a risk canvas, a GBV risk canvas. This is adapted from the work of ACAPS, who worked with an interaction to develop a protection risk canvas. And what we did was we just adapted that for the GBV context and then discussed it in the workshop setting to find which bits made sense and which bits didn't. And what we ended up with was something like this. Essentially, we'd be asking teams to think about using something like this in their pre-existing design work. And we definitely got the feeling from the workshops that a lot of teams are already doing a lot of this work, but what's not happening is it's not being formalized or written down in a structured format. And this tool is supposed to help with that. So there are elements here that are fairly straightforward, like the background, what types of GBV risk are being faced. But then there's a breakdown in terms of what threats are there. So is it armed actors that are sexually assaulting women and girls? And then are there specific vulnerabilities? Is it young women or is it older women? Is it people collecting firewood or is it different contexts? And then there's capacities to mitigate those risks, such as purchasing firewood from local markets instead of collecting it, something like that. So these are all just examples of how you can build that richer picture of the GBV risk at project level. But then beyond that, I think the value of that ACAPS canvas that we've tried to translate here is that it helps you go from that analysis to starting to think about, well, what are the scenarios we can think of here? How is this going to go? Is this risk going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Is it going to stay the same? And what would be the triggers for those changes, if so? And once you've got that, then you can start thinking about things that the organization can do to mitigate that risk, whether that's by doing things that help to reduce the threat or the vulnerability, or things that build upon pre-existing capacities to increase them in the future. So really, that's the direction of that module on risk analysis. There's a lot more in it, but that's the rough direction of it. If we can move on to the next slide, and then the next slide straight afterwards, Ife. Module 2, thank you, on program design. We're starting from the assumption that you've got something like that level of nuanced picture at risk in terms of your risk analysis, and then thinking about how you build a program design around it. And really, this did come down to a kind of a 101 on theories of change, by which I mean we were actually trying to strip it back to its bare basics. Why do we need to think about theories of change? So rather than just thinking about a log frame like you've got at the top there, where you link your activities through to your outputs and your results and your outcomes, instead of just doing that, thinking about the core sort of benefits of doing a full theory of change in terms of understanding the causal assumptions that you're making. So what assumptions have you made in terms of thinking that the outputs of your activities will lead to the results, the intended results that you had? So if you're, in this example on the screen, if you're providing cash assistance to households because you want to try and reduce food insecurity, which you think then may have a longer term impact upon gender-based violence, well, there's a question there about whether cash will actually reduce food insecurity, and there's an assumption about the availability of food on local markets that would have to be in place for that to work. And so what we're doing here again is something that we think teams already do, but we'd like more teams to do it explicitly in terms of listing each of the causal assumptions that they're making in the program design, not because they're bad assumptions, not by any means. They're very often exactly the right assumptions to make because they're embedded in a rich understanding of local context. But the point is, if you want to evaluate it, you need to have those assumptions outlined so that you can go out and test them and learn about whether that happened or whether it didn't happen, and what more we can learn about it. So that's the rough sort of direction of the project design module. We kept it quite narrowly focused on that work. There's a bit more to it than that, but we can come back to that in the Q&A if needed. Ife, if you could skip forward another 2 slides, then we can move on to module 3, where we're looking at the measurement considerations. So here it starts to get more M&E focused. What we're doing here is, first of all, clarifying what we're talking about. And I mean that in a sort of a basic sense, in terms of a lot of the monitoring frameworks that we saw in the scoping study, but also whilst we worked with teams in the field for the workshops, a lot of the frameworks were focused at output level. And even when they were kind of considered to be outcome oriented, they were often output oriented. So I don't really think we need to get into a debate about the definitions of outcomes or results or impacts or any of that. What we need to do is think about the fact that we've actually got a lot of systems in place to monitor the world of the program, right? The activities and the services that are provided and the perceptions of those services by affected people. You know, there are systems in place that are working on that. What we're lacking and what we're trying to encourage here is more work to make measurements of changes in the community over time, behavior changes. It doesn't have to necessarily be just the reduced incidence of GBV, but it could be the behaviors, the norms, beliefs, the policy changes that lead up to that reduced incidence of GBV. But the point is that all of these things are things that happen in the realm of the community, not of the program, right? And that's where we're trying to focus our efforts. So if you switch to the next slide, we can probably talk through sort of a couple of examples of what we mean by that. I mean, the first point is just to say that one way you can do this is to start thinking about what's hard to measure in the community and what can we do when it's too hard to measure, what alternatives do we have? So when you're trying to measure things like incidence of GBV, of course, that is extremely challenging. There are lots of ethical issues around that, and it's also very hard practically to do and to do it in a reliable way. But there are other things that can be measured that are still in the community. They're not specifically related to your project or program. So they're community level changes, but they might be associated with reductions in GBV. So here we're looking at proxy indicators, indirect measures of the thing that you're trying to measure. And so what we're suggesting in the framework is that you can look to the risk equation to try and provide inputs into that kind of proxy indicator framework. So in normal language, that just means thinking about the risks at context-specific level in a broad sense and understanding what measures we have of community capacity to respond to that risk, and what measures we have of vulnerability, and what measures we have of threat, and thinking about ways we can make measurements there. So we've increased the number of things that we can make measurements of in order to try and improve the quality of our measurement systems. So the examples you have on the screen there are things like, instead of trying to just measure sort of increased capacity to prevent intimate partner violence, which is a very hard thing to measure conceptually, let alone ethically and practically, you can also look to measure things like improvements in household financial security or greater female participation in household decision making, right? So these are indirect measures of the kind of capacity change that you're trying to measure. So that's the first point, is we look at ways that you can try to broaden the range of things that you're measuring in order to stay focused at the world of the community, rather than just retreating to measuring outputs and perceptions of outputs. So if you can move to the next slide, that would be great. The next point we make in this module is just the introduction of outcome mapping as a tool for doing this. So outcome mapping is a tool that has about 20 years of history in the development sector. We haven't seen many examples of it being used in the GBV prevention sector in humanitarian context. And so what we did was we tried to strip it down to its raw bones to try and make it as doable as possible in the time constraints that people face. So really what it means is doing this. First of all, defining the vision. Where do you want the community to be in a few years' time with respect to the GBV risk that you've identified? Secondly, identifying the boundary partners, the people that are going to help the community get there. So they're going to be influencers within the community, or they might be people in peer groups, there might be people at school, there might be people in women's groups. It could be any situation, but the point is that there are people in the community that have influence over the wider population over time. And then you identify progress markers. So these are markers of change towards the change you want to get to. So here we're thinking about types of policy changes or beliefs or norms that need to change in order to reduce GBV incidence. And what we did in this module is walk teams through a way to build that kind of framework in place before the programming has begun, so that then you can make high quality measurement during the implementation. So let's skip on now, another 2 slides. If we can move on to the last module, which is on evaluation approaches. So here what we're doing is, assuming you've got that context-specific risk analysis, the theory of change, and the sort of monitoring framework in place, you now have an evaluable entity, an evaluable project. This last module is about how you do the evaluation itself. And the answer here is, it depends. You have to fit your particular tools to the context you're working in, the program you're working on, and the types of changes you're trying to bring about. So we start off with a decision tree where we walk teams through the sort of types of challenges they're facing. If the raw problem is that you don't have evidence of any change, then you're going to need some tools that can help you collect that type of evidence. If, on the other hand, the problem is that you've got evidence of change, but you're not sure if you can really say your program was related to it, well, then there are tools like contribution analysis and process tracing that can be used to assess your contribution to that change. And so really we use this module to walk teams through those different tools and to give them some sort of starting thoughts and some references for further work if they want to use them. So if we skip on to the next slide, I'll try and go through these as quickly as possible because I am conscious of time. The first one of these tools is outcome journals and results journals. So really what we're doing here is asking people in the community, if possible, to go out and measure on a periodic basis, every week, every month, it doesn't matter, you decide. But the point is you're trying to measure changes in the community. So it might be change perceptions of domestic violence amongst male members of a household, something like that. And you'd measure it repeatedly over time so that you can then build up the types of framework you can see on the screen there. You can get quantitative data out of it, or you can just have open-ended qualitative descriptions of how those changes are taking place. So that's one way of doing it, and we sort of explain how to do it in a rigorous way in the framework. If you move on to the next tool, we look at most significant change, which is a similar type of tool, can be done in a similar journaling diary type process. But what's really powerful about it is that you ask people in the community what the most significant change is in the area of your interest. So you might say to communities, if you're working on an IPV prevention program, you might say, well, what's the most significant change you've seen in terms of the relationships between genders at household level in your community, or something like that. And they will then tell you what the biggest change is and why that's been significant. And the purpose of that is if you compile those stories, you can learn about the value of your program in a way that you might not have anticipated, because it's the effective people telling you what was significant rather than what your assumptions are. And then the next tool is a slightly different one. This is one where you already have the evidence of the change. You might have used those journal approaches to build up evidence. Then you need to understand how you contributed to it. So contribution analysis is just a way of going about that in a rigorous way, where you think about the causal logic you had, the causal assumptions you identified in your program design, and then you think about external factors that might have led to the same changes. And then you go through a process of fairly soft sort of evidential review. It can be secondary review, so you don't have to go out and do more data collection. You can just look at the evidence you've got and test it against the assumption that your program led to the change versus something else. And you can then use that to build a more nuanced story of how you contributed to a change amongst many other factors. And then the last tool that I just wanted to touch on, if you could move to the next slide, is process tracing, which is essentially an even more detailed way of doing that contribution analysis, where you can actually provide quite sort of, in some cases, statistically valid, in other cases, just very, very detailed stories of how your project may have been necessary for the change that came about, or it may have been sufficient, or it may have been neither, but was still very important. And you can use this process tracing tool as a way to separate your claims in a much more rigorous way that can be really strong for reporting back to the wider community about what you've done and how you've done it, but can also make sense of the fact that there are many different actors involved in GBV prevention, not just your project or program. And so process tracing is a great way of picking out those many different aspects in your evaluation of your success. So I think I'm going to have to leave it there. We've pretty much run out of time, but there's a lot of tools in there and a lot of stuff that I think we could reflect on and discuss in more detail. I really hope that these tools can be picked up and used and piloted in different organizational contexts, so we can start learning about which things work and which things could be adapted, and what tools we could add to the toolbox. But thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. It's been a real pleasure working on this project, and I'll hand back to Jessica and then wait for the panel to begin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. That was really great. And it really is a rich body of work. And so what Neil has presented is really just the tip of it for you to kind of entice you to look at it and to dive in even more so you can start to use it. And of course, we'll have more opportunities to discuss it. We're actually going to move to the panel discussion now. I know many of you have questions already, and so what I want to do is encourage you to go ahead and start typing in your questions into the chat or the Q&A, whichever one you prefer, and we will be collecting those and giving them to our moderator during the panel discussion, and we'll integrate your questions into that discussion. So if we can go to the next slide. Great. So I'm going to introduce the panel and our moderator, and then we'll have hopefully a rich discussion with everybody and answer some of your questions as well before turning to more information towards the end of the webinar about the next phase in piloting the framework. So our moderator today is Dr. Jocelyn Kelly. She's the director from Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and she leads the program for gender rights and resilience. She's also one of our steering group members on the GBV PEF work. And then our panelists today, we have two colleagues from Heartland Alliance who are both in Nigeria. We have Tawabola Olafunke, who is the program manager and technical advisor on sexual reproductive health, as well. And Paul Ameche leads the strategic information team within Heartland Alliance. And what's interesting about having both of them, as Neil talked about, a lot of the methods that we have introduced do come from the development community, and we're adapting them to conflict situations. So Heartland Alliance is a great example where we're bringing in two colleagues, one more in a more development setting, but trying to integrate some of their approaches into a conflict setting as well. So really grateful that they're both here. We also have Laura Satel, who is the protection coordinator with Danish Refugee Council in South Sudan. So welcome, Laura. And lastly, also we have May Maloney, who's the deputy head, who's addressing the sexual violence at the ICRC in Geneva. So this is our panel, and I will turn it over to Jocelyn to kick us off with some of the discussion. And we can take this slide down, and if people are able to show their faces, they will. Some connections aren't as great, so they may not see, you may not see them, but hopefully you can hear them.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's such a pleasure and a delight to be here with you all to talk about this exciting effort, and particularly to hear about people on the ground who are reflecting on how these tools might best apply to their work. So on that note, I'd like to start us off with a question that's intended to set the stage for our following discussion. And I open this to 2 or 3 panelists who would like to jump in and speak to this issue. So, as we all know, it's no surprise that measuring GBV prevention is a challenge. We've all been struggling with how to demonstrate results in a thoughtful and evidence-based way for years. So we'd love to hear from you, kind of at the forefront of this effort. What progress has been made? What are some of the biggest challenges that you continue to face when you think about measuring and an evaluation of outcomes for GBV prevention? And then if I may, to unpack the last piece of the question, in terms of the challenges, do you feel like these are really about the nature of GBV risks themselves and how hard they are to measure? Or are the challenges really about the constraints of time, resourcing, skills, and capacity within your organization? And you are allowed to say it's about both. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to panelists who would like to tackle this first opening question.
Hi, Jocelyn, it's Laura here. I'll just put on my video for a second and say hello to everyone. And it's great to be part of the discussion. I'll kick it off because there's a myriad of challenges, which I think we can all speak to, everyone probably in attendance at this webinar. But then I'm going to say it's both. It's both the challenges about the nature of GBV risk, as well as challenges within the humanitarian sector around time, resource, and skills. You have the separate challenge of collecting good data to generate a comprehensive context-specific GBV risk analysis, and then the challenge of then connecting the changes you want to see, or more so the changes that the community want to see, to measurable outcomes. And you know, this is due in part to the challenges around collecting GBV data and the safety and ethical implications there, as well as due to staff skills and capacity, both within, I think, meal teams, to understand GBV risk. And for them to do that, you need to provide them that context-specific GBV risk analysis. And then relatedly, for meal staff to then support on the design of a causal logic for the program. It often gets put in the like too hard or too sensitive basket by M&E staff, where I think there's certainly a role they can play. And I think that challenge comes from a lack of measurement tools that support safe, ethical outcome measurements. And then it's relatedly a challenge for protection teams to understand and then prioritize M&E processes. And it's particularly challenging in South Sudan because we have serious access issues. There's certain locations that are cut off for 3 months at a time, and not just in terms of physical accessibility, but actual, you just have patchy phone network. And so the conversations you're having with staff are about, okay, how many awareness raising sessions did you conduct today? And there's little time or kind of access to staff to have those conversations around outcomes. And again, it relates to not having like a selection of fit for purpose tools that you can make context specific and are user friendly and can be picked up by GBV staff, not just meal staff who also can't access the locations. There's many more. I'll leave it there for some other panelists to jump in.
Thank you very much, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm just gonna put up my video so that you can see my face. Thank you. I'm gonna make my intervention drawing from the experience on one of our projects here in Nigeria, a project funded by USAID, focusing on key populations. And it's called a Key Population Community HIV Services. And drawing from the experience on this project, I can really speak to the fact that the female sex workers, the men who have sex with men, the transgender, and the people who inject drugs, you know, these are people that face a lot of GBV issues. And this in turn predisposes them to HIV, general poor health seeking behavior, and also contributes to interruptions in terms of, you know, retaining them on treatment, particularly for those that are HIV positive. Our GBV interventions, you know, have been largely focused on addressing structural barriers that kind of inhibits their access and uptake of services. Then in specific terms, one of the biggest challenges we've faced in measuring GBV outcomes, you know, is basically the lack of a robust, you know, GBV performance evaluation framework itself. And arising from this, basically, we just focus on, you know, tracking GBV incidences, you know, looking at the output indicators, you know, the trainings and all that. And we have not been able to really link this up with the outcomes in concrete terms. I will just pause here and allow other panelists to come in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, this is Funke speaking from Nigeria. I'll put on my camera just for you to see my face. So then I'll put it off. Yeah, I'm going to ride on Paul's submission. He was able to talk about one of our projects. So I'll be talking about another project and the challenges in terms of measuring GBV issues. This our sexual and reproductive health project in Usara from Kingdom of Netherlands. This project actually is responsible for, you know, building the capacity of female sex workers and female dog users to be able to identify their sexual and reproductive health issues, knows their rights, and be able to access necessary care and prevention services. And so when you're talking about GBV prevention, of course, from experience, we were doing a lot of that on the project, but from experience in terms of challenges with measurement, if you do not carry them along at the designing stage, It's usually a problem. You know, when you're designing your project, you know, if they were not involved in knowing the objective of the project, knowing what we want to achieve at the end of the day, knowing the impact that is going to come out of it, knowing what is going to be of benefit to them as a community is going to be a very big challenge, you know, and for them, especially for the drug users communities, these are people, you know, that are not really, you know, too much concerned about what you are out for. You need to take your time to let them understand, you know, those issues and why they need that is of benefit to them. And some of them really, when they talk about gender-based violence issues, that's things that they're very familiar with. They never see them as GBV, you know, for example, drug users depending on the main counterparts for drug, and of course, they've been abused in the process, you know, exchange syringes in the process, and carry out all sorts of, you know, sexual violence issues, but they never see it as an issue because for them, it's just to create access to their drug. So you need to be able to get them to understand this first, that those are GBV issues and it's depriving them access to other necessary care and prevention services before you can even go ahead to measure and say you want to provide one form of care or the other. And some of them, when you look at protection, you know, some of the perpetrators of all these GBV, you know, issues, actually for the female sex workers, are their clients. Some are their clients, some are the hotel managers, some are even the security agencies around. You know, so if you do not really let them understand that you have enough protection for them, you know, it will be difficult for them to open up when you are trying to, you know, sample them in terms of GBVs, prevailing GBV issues in their community, and now you want to support that. So those are some of all those challenges. You need to really get them into the program, you know, be at the designing stage, at the process stage, you know, even when you want to get to the measurement stage, you know, for them to be able to accommodate you and understand what you're doing. And also, you know, we have another project in the Northeast that is, you know, addressing the issue of trafficking, you know, people at the refugee camps, and issues of this series of unrest that is happening at the Northeast Nigeria. You know, so our target population there is actually the government agencies to be able to provide support. You know, for these people, you know, for them, you know, even opening themselves up, you know, to GBV issues is a means of getting access to necessary care, you know, in terms of support from security agencies, support from government and all that. So for you to be able to adequately measure that, you also need to let them understand the implication of that, let them understand where there are issues, and also let them understand why, you know, the outcome of the GBVs, you know, on them and on their health system. So I think generally just need to carry them along, you know, at the designing stage, and also ensure they are also into the process, you know, of your implementation as much as possible for you to get into it. Thank you.
I think you've spoken so thoughtfully to this idea of how hard it is to do, first of all, programming with incredibly vulnerable populations, the exact kind of populations you highlighted in your remarks, and the importance of kind of community collaboration and working hand in hand with those local communities that you're working with, and particularly how difficult but how important it is with particularly hard to reach populations. May, I'd like to bring you in now with a slightly more specific question. So we know that humanitarian actors can kind of have a little bit more difficulty sometimes addressing the threat component of risk. And especially this is something that we see when we look at the actual perpetrators of violence. So this is definitely not the case, as we all know, with ICRC's work. So ICRC does a lot of vital work with armed actors to reduce GBV incidents and conflict situations. So I'd like to ask you how you think we as a sector can best measure change in these contexts when engaging directly with armed groups, and the types and tools of approaches that might work in this kind of setting.
How to measure behavioral change. If I get it right, please can you just repeat the question again?
Oh, thanks, Olufuke. I was actually directing that to May and related to some of her work with perpetrators of armed violence.
Okay, all right, fine.
Great, thanks so much. I'm just going to turn on the camera very briefly to say hello. because I know that we've had some connection problems. I mean, yeah, so much to say to complement my co-panelists who've just said so much about the challenges of addressing capacities, addressing populations. And yeah, we really do find that in our work addressing in particular the threat factor, that there are a couple of, I guess, top level challenges and then a couple of lessons that I'd like to sort of share and discuss. I mean, obviously at the top level challenges, there's the question about measurement over time and the timeframes that we're talking about for measuring change related to prevention. And the other is around access. And in particular, we have a challenge around continuous access to interlocutors, to the same interlocutors for addressing threat over time. So what does that mean? Well, the ICRC, we engage with weapons bearers. That's not at all new to us as an ICRC. And we engage with weapons bearers on many different angles to do with how they conduct hostilities related to international humanitarian law. And one aspect of that is engaging with them about the issue of sexual violence. So we would typically engage with weapons bearers, whether that's state or non-state armed actors, detaining authorities or police, to share international humanitarian law and to teach them about and engage in a discussion about really sexual violence as a potential war crime, as a crime against humanity or potential act of genocide. And so one way that we approach this is that we've adopted a position of the reverse burden of proof, which means that wherever we operate, we take the basis that we take it as a starting point that we will need to actively engage in prevention, in reducing the threat that these actors in the humanitarian landscape may perpetrate sexual violence, but also to raise their capacities to prevent it, to be a good responder to it. So in terms of this work, we're talking about not just directly a discussion about command or what the rules of engagement are, but we're also talking about engaging with attitudes, engaging with people's values, and that is where the work on prevention lies. So in an effort to improve our effectiveness in our overall efforts to discuss the laws of war, we conducted research called The Roots of Restraint some years ago. And from that, we developed some specific resources on how to engage with armed actors in dialogue about sexual violence. So we've also done some assessments on attitudes of young men, and all of these pieces come together to really show the multiple levels that we need to work on prevention. However, the measurement of that, we have good practice is what I'm trying to say, but the measurement of that has been challenging over time. So this toolkit and all of this work has been of incredible interest to us because we face the challenge of potentially some of those actors being less open towards the theme, maybe not having a sense of ownership, but we're starting to break down those barriers. Where we now face the risk is, measuring how effective we've been in these tools that we've developed to grade the engagement of these armed actors, to look at where they're at and what change is needed. And so I think we find, this PEF is really going to be instrumental in that. For example, we think the evaluation approaches around contribution analysis is going to be really interesting for us. Most significant change, and the idea that we could engage our interlocutors on what they think the most significant change has been. These are really, I think, going to be instrumental as we try to look at this over time. Because it is critical that we look at a new and expanded time frame. Oftentimes we're talking about a one-year project plan, we're talking about a one-year or single agency approach, and we need to move beyond that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, May. I think this idea of tracking change over time is so critical, especially when you're looking at something as complex and challenging as gender-based violence. I'd like to turn to the panel now and bring up a topic that I know is of interest, particularly to our audience. And we've had a number of questions submitted on the testing and kind of putting the legs on this tool and watching it really hit the field. So we know that the GBV PEF introduces several methods for measuring and evaluating GBV prevention, and particularly at the outcome level. Many of these approaches aren't new, but they've mostly been used in development contexts. So as we think about adapting and tailoring these needs to GBV and humanitarian crisis, we know that we still need to pilot and continue our learning. So what kind of methods seemed most promising to you, and why, from each of you as you listen to Neil's presentation? And I'd love to also hear from you all who also had such a critical role in helping us adapt the PEF. What was some of your experience and learning coming out of those workshops as well?
Hey, Jocelyn, I'll jump in here because the field testing was really, to be honest, it was a really inspirational kind of workshop for us, because the risk equation resonated really resonated with the team, and using that as a measurement tool, as basically the different components of the risk equation as proxy indicators for looking at reduction in GBV risk. And it's been particularly helpful recently when we've been looking at findings from a recent midterm evaluation we did of a SASA program we're implementing in South Sudan. SASA, I won't go into it, but is a community mobilization approach to the prevention of violence against women and girls. It's based on the stages of change model. And as I mentioned, we recently conducted this midline evaluation. We did have baseline data, so obviously that is helpful. But I know that in the PEF, there's other methods to measure outcomes where you don't need baseline data, which I think is going to be a really useful component of the PEF. But basically, we pulled apart the findings from this SASA evaluation according to the risk equation. And so we were looking at, what are these findings saying about the threat component? What are they saying about the vulnerability component? What are they saying the impacts are on the capacities component from the program? And basically, we were trying to determine, are we decreasing threats, decreasing vulnerability, increasing capacity based on, so we looked specifically at the risk of women and girls experiencing SGBV within their homes, so perpetrated by intimate partners. So we analysed that risk according to the risk equation, and we looked at, we understand that community acceptance of violence against women is contributing to an increased GBV risk, as it's serving as an incentive for the behaviour of the causal agent to that threat. So the behaviour of the perpetrator is being incentivised by this community acceptance of violence against women. And so we looked at, one of the questions we asked in this evaluation is, in the last 12 months, have you spoken out against violence against women in your community? Within the last 12 months. And we looked at the baseline data, and we looked at the midterm data. And there was an increase in respondents saying they had spoken out about against violence against women in their community. And we're seeing that as a kind of, obviously, a disincentivizing that causal agent's behavior. So just disincentivizing the perpetrator to continue to behave in that manner, and therefore as a kind of a decrease on the threat component of the risk equation, and therefore, hopefully indication that the indication is that the intermediate results we're seeing should suggest decrease in GBV risk. So it's been, that risk equation component has been really helpful, and it's also just been extremely helpful for monitoring, I guess, for actual learning that can be used to adapt the project. Because what we also learned from analysing the findings against the risk equation is that we're not touching capacity. Capacities was nearly being kind of disregarded, and you need to work across all those components of the risk equation to reach the ultimate outcome you're looking for, or the communities are looking for. And so we learned that from unpacking the risk equation against those findings, and now we're adapting the program to better target the capacity component of the equation. So yeah, really excited about that particular tool and a couple of others, but I'll just give some of my co-panelists a chance to speak.
Thanks so much, Laura. And as your co-panelists are thinking about their responses to my previous question, I'll just complicate it a bit by adding in some additional questions from the audience, which are really thoughtful, including, so not only what methods feel like they might be most pertinent for your work from the PEF, but we had a great question from Oheneba, who said, what are the roles that governments, armed groups, and affected communities must play under this GBV framework? And so I think that's a great question for us to consider as we move forward.
Hello, I believe you can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
I'll quickly intervene, drawing from the very last question from the audience, talking about the role the government and the community members could play in bringing this to reality. And I think it's all part of the engagement, at the program design level, bringing the government participants on board through the process. And I like to speak particularly to the theory of change. The government participants, all the stakeholders will need to have a shared understanding and also opportunity to make contributions, to that theory of change to reflect their context and, have agreement that this is the pathway to the outcome that we want to see. And I think that is a very critical, approach to bringing them to participate in the framework implementation. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Paul. We had a really interesting question from the audience, and I think this is top of mind for many of us. But the question was that people would be really interested in understanding how the key GBV mitigation and response indicators and data collection procedures could be adapted during the time of the pandemic when movement restrictions and in-person contacts are limited. I know this is something everyone's struggling with on a day-to-day basis, and it would be fascinating to hear from our panel about that.
I think it's been really hard to adapt how we monitor and evaluate GBV risk when you don't have access because of COVID, but it's also something in South Sudan you come up against quite often for other reasons. I think we haven't managed to kind of address that challenge yet, but there are definitely tools within the PEF that I think can prove really helpful for that. So the results journaling I am also really excited about because it's recording community-based changes within the community over time, not just number of activities, and it can be done by your field staff in the field, like where they're based and where you can't move to that location. And I guess Neil would have much more comprehensive understanding of this particular methodology. But I do think with staff where you have minimal access to, and even they have minimal access to the community, if it's based on mapping or like just tracking changes in risk or patterns in risk over time, you can access communities at different points in time. And I just think this one, not fully understanding it because the PEF hasn't been released, it's only been field tested with us. I think there's real potential for the results journaling to overcome those access challenges. Yeah.
I'd love to jump in on that if I may, Jocelyn and Laura. Is that okay? Listening with interest there, I think that actually Laura began with an interesting point there, that the access problem is not new, right? The pandemic has kind of forced us to come together as an M&E community, as a humanitarian community, and figure out ways that we can cope with it as best we can. But the truth is, a context like South Sudan, Laura and her teams have years of experience of trying to do monitoring in light of massive access challenges that are in some senses almost scarier than the pandemic. And so I think it's worth noting that it isn't brand new, and that we do have a kind of a history of trying to deal with remote monitoring tools. And there's the work of SAVE that was DFID at the time, that kind of compiled some tools for doing remote monitoring and use of technology in those contexts. But what I would say about the PEF is that I have a bit of a tension in my response to it, because on the one hand, there are tools there, like Laura said, and let's come on to the journals in a second. But on the other hand, a big drive in the work of the PEF is to focus on community-based program design and high levels of community engagement in the monitoring and indeed the assessment and the giving of value to, or the statements of value about a project or program. So that means working closely with people, and that's quite hard when there are transport and transit restrictions. So I think that it's actually a massive problem, and it's very confrontational for what we're trying to get organizations to do. But there are tools there that are useful. And coming on to Laura's point about the journals, that's an interesting tool because it's the kind of thing that has a bit of setup cost in terms of working with people in the community to not train, but to discuss how to go about doing that journaling in a consistent way, but also in a way that's going to be useful for the team and crucially for the community. But once that cost is paid, and once you've done it, you then have a group of people who are already in situ in the community, who are actually quite capable of giving you really good evidence about change. And that's invaluable in a context like COVID. So there definitely are tools there, and I think Laura's on to a good point about the results journal. I just think that the sort of hesitation I have is that the community-based approach, which in fact Paul was almost being too modest about, the work that Heartland Alliance has done in terms of bringing the community into project design is incredible. But doing that in a pandemic context is very, very challenging. I think that we do have to kind of pay respect to the do no harm principle whenever we're thinking about how we ask people to come together in a focus group context, or how we ask members of the community itself to move throughout that community collecting data. We have to be very careful about what that can do in terms of creating harm, or in the specific context of the pandemic, adding to the virus vectors. So I would add that as a kind of a caution, but I think that Laura's right, that a tool that's very rooted in the community, like the journal process, or even the most significant change process, can be very powerful because you have your data collectors in situ, rather than requiring transit across a country.
Neil, thank you so much. And just because you're off mute now, we had 2 questions from the audience about how one might use this tool to measure GBV advocacy or GBV information campaign outcomes. There's a lot of interest around that, so would love to hear your reflections on that, and of course, from the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, okay, well, let me kick off then, Jocelyn. So thanks for that question. It's a fantastic one. It's not one that we went to in detail in the PEF explicitly, but it is one that we've thought about when we're designing it. So if you look at something like process tracing, which is the tool I just rushed in at the end of the presentation, we go through it in more detail in the framework itself. That's actually a tool that has almost been, I don't want to say designed for, but it's very well suited to things like looking at advocacy and the way that an organization has had influence on a wider policy level change. And the reason is it looks at contribution in a sort of a nuanced and varied way. So instead of saying yes or no, my project influenced that policy shift, instead you're saying, all right, well, it might have had some influence along with some other factors. And it might be that if you hadn't have done that project, those other factors wouldn't have been in play, and therefore the change wouldn't have happened. That's one way to influence. Or there's another way that you kind of think of more as the sort of smoking gun type of test in the process tracing language, which is where, let's say, a policy or a law changes and a policymaker says, it was the advocacy of this organization, or it was a conversation I had with this person that led to that change. Well, that's a straightforward example, right? A very clear example of contribution, but it's not the only type. And so process tracing tries to lay out 4 different types of contribution in terms of necessity and sufficiency of your work for the change. And it can sound academic, but the point is you've got a wide range of descriptions there. You don't just have to say, yes, we influenced, or no, we didn't, or we don't have evidence because we can't set up a control trial. You don't need to worry about that. You can say there are different ways that we can contribute to change, and a tool like process tracing is really good at sort of teasing out those things in a much more, a richer, but also a more rigorous and meaningful way. So I would definitely encourage the use of process tracing for a situation like that.
If I may, I'd like to turn to each of our panelists now for closing reflections, and you can pick up any of the threads that have come up in our conversation so far. I know we have a lot of interest in piloting and bringing this tool forward. Jessica will speak to that in our closing, so I want you to know we've heard your questions, we've heard your interest, and we'll definitely pick that up. I know in the chat we've also had questions about people in transit and how to guarantee the protection of LGBTQIA+ individuals. And so I think those are considerations people might keep in the back of their minds as they share perhaps a 1-minute closing reflection with us before we move on. So if I may, I'm just going to call on people. Paul, would you start us off with these reflections? Oh, I know. Paul, go ahead. I just saw you go off.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I was a little bit distracted. I didn't get the question very well.
No worries. Just 1 minute of closing reflections for you on this project. And some of the Q&A had brought up the importance of acknowledging the vulnerability of people in transit as well as LGBTQIA populations. I know that's something that you all work on. And so just a 1-minute closing reflection, we might go around the table before passing over to Jessica.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, I want to say that the PEF is a process that we really looked up to with a lot of expectation. And I'm super excited, you know, at what we've seen so far, particularly the tools that have been enumerated. I think moving forward in terms of the theory of change development around the GBV interventions and all that, is really going to help to get it, you know, more robust and more contextualized. And for me, this is like a very important step in, towards, you know, ensuring that evaluations of outcomes, you know, are well done. So I look out for the PEF, you know, to be able to add value to our services, and as we work with the key populations here in Nigeria. Over.
Thank you so much. I might pass over to May if I could.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think just the emphasis on the adaptability and the specificity of this toolkit means that when we examine a challenge like SGBV related to migration or SGBV against people on the move, that this toolkit offers the adaptability and the modularity to really be specific about what you're trying to address. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. We're really looking forward to this being a consistent reminder and a toolkit that is so adaptable to the multiple things that we are trying to measure and evaluate, but also a consistent reminder about making sure that we look at all angles of the risk analysis. And for us, outcome mapping, contribution analysis, the discussion that the proxy indicators guidance will provoke, or provoke's not the right word, will encourage us to have is super important. And I think in terms of what sort of broader structural change this might herald or bring, we definitely need to think about multi-year, multi-context, and potentially multi-agency work where we work in consortia together, where we're working with communities to really learn the lessons and improve the practice and the sharing that we can do around prevention in humanitarian settings, because it is a space where there is, you know, controversy or questions about the lessons learned.
Perfect. Olafunke, do you have any closing reflections you'd like to share with us? We might have lost her. I know her connection was not very strong. So if she comes back on, I think we can turn back to her, but perhaps Laura, you would take us home in terms of closing reflections.
Sure. Obviously, as you might have gathered from the way I've been speaking about the PEF and different components of the PEF, I'm extremely excited about it, and we're really looking forward to hopefully being a part of piloting some of these tools in South Sudan. I do think there needs to be, though, some kind of next steps or just commitments, both in terms of commitment within M&E teams to piloting these new ways of measurement and working. And I hope that there was equal amount of interest in the launch of the PEF in this webinar from Camille colleagues as there are from protection colleagues. And I also echo May's point there that more multi-year funding would be helpful just in terms of funding GBV in general, because we're obviously trying to address root causes, which is a multi-year kind of, you need multiple amount of time to do so. And to even address or measure the impact of the contributing factors to GBV risk, it also takes time. And okay, it's already come up, but I would like to just draw attention again to the very short turnaround period you have for proposals. And if you really want a participatory approach with communities to identification of GBV risk, and if you haven't been able to continuously capture risk analysis while programming, because that in itself is challenging, then we do need more time before, you know, all proposals are released and then the proposal submission is required. And yeah, I think that would really help us to be able to put the PEF to use and measure those outcomes that we need to be able to measure, because unless we don't know what we're doing is actually contributing to the change we want to see or communities want to see. And then maybe even bringing third-party monitors into the fold would be helpful, because it's such a great framework. I really feel passionate about it. And if there's third-party evaluations of projects, I think there's kind of some, you know, role we could play in like providing this framework for them to use when they're coming to do these external evaluations, or at least contributing to their evaluations with a few of these tools that could be used. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think with that, I know how eager the audience is to hear a bit more from Jessica about next steps and piloting. I think some of the closing reflections on the comments from our incredible panelists really highlight how incredibly difficult it is to measure prevention of gender-based violence. Prevention itself is hard to measure. And of course, GBV is an incredibly sensitive and hidden issue in so many communities. It's change that occurs, as Laura noted, over the long term. And there's no kind of quick fixes to start shifting GBV attitudes and to begin measuring how prevention activities contribute to outcomes. Having said that, I think we all acknowledge that new tools that are best suited for each context are critical, and I think the PEF begins to highlight some of these tools that we can use. And overall, the engagement of communities who are in fact the experts in these issues is kind of critical and the most important part of what we highlight in the PEF. So Jessica, with that, I will hand over to you so you can tell us more about how we take this tool forward.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and thank you so much to all the panelists. It really was a really rich discussion. You guys added in so much, and I know it's making the audience really eager to see and learn about what this framework is all about. So if we can pull up the PowerPoint really quickly. The last 10 minutes of our webinar today, I want to talk a little bit about the next phase. So as we have said, we have only just finished the development of the framework. And again, it is live now. It's on the Interaction website. We've put the link in the chat a couple of times, so you can definitely go there and download it. But there's a lot more coming with it. So this is obviously, this is our launch, but there's a lot more. You'll hear more about it, and there'll be more in-depth conversations, so that don't feel like this is the last time. So I want to talk a little bit about the piloting phase. That's what we're moving into. We expect it to be over the next 2.5 years. And this is because the methodology that we're using is an open source methodology. So we're really trying to distribute this quite widely and encourage as many different organizations who are interested to use the PEF. And this allows us to then test it in multiple places around the world, in different types of contexts, to really be able to understand what is working and what is not. It also enables organizations who feel that they may not be ready just now to pilot, but they're really interested, to come on in a couple months or a year down the road and still be able to use it and participate in the piloting phase. So we realize that not everybody has the resources at this time, but that you want to. But at the same time, the methodology, the approach that we're taking is that you don't have to pilot the entire thing. There are various aspects within the framework itself. So there's parts that you could test out. So taking on just one methodology or one approach, like outcome mapping or perhaps contribution analysis, and take that and test that and share back the learning from that. I know other organizations might want to look at the entire framework and look at how they can test everything. And of course, we're open to that as well. But it really is a framework that emphasizes to start where you are. So you can pick it up regardless of the resources that you have, the capacities that you have. You should still be able to pick it up and identify where you fit right now and what you can do and where you are aiming for and hoping to build. So it is very much designed in that way. And again, it's very much focused at a field practical level and intends to bring in both GBV actors as well as meal teams. So hopefully it's speaking the language across both, so that you understand each other at the same time. So that is a key aspect of the way that it was designed, and then hopefully how we intend to pilot it. The methodology also gives us an opportunity to collect the learning from different organizations, as well as around different GBV issues. So some of you may be very much focused on intimate partner violence, others may be looking at trafficking or engaging with armed groups for sexual violence, et cetera. It allows us to then really understand how the PEF is adaptable or can be used in addressing different GBV issues and risks, but also in different settings and by different organizations who take on different aspects of the threat or vulnerability or capacity of the risk. This as well allows us to document what we're seeing and start to build the evidence that we know is needed to improve the way that we measure GBV outcomes. So I kind of skipped out, I talked about the methodology, but our target really here is any organization that has declared GBV prevention as an outcome. It doesn't matter if you're doing GBV and you have GBV experts and that's your focus. It really emphasizes that, and this is because we recognize it is so essential to achieve a protection outcome for GBV that we're looking at multidisciplinary approaches and methods to come together to actually strategize and think about those different interventions that are needed across sectors and disciplines. So really, again, any organization that has declared this as an outcome. So if we move to the next slide. This is just a little bit of a way to entice you to join and participate. I want to give a little bit of a heads up about what's coming, what you should expect in the next couple of months before we really get going. But as I said, there is a link right now on Interaction's webpage where you can download the full framework itself. But in the summer, in a couple of months, we actually will be launching a full interactive web page for the framework. And this will really help organizations better navigate the PEF. There'll be additional resources and tools. And as part of that, we will also be launching a few orientation packages that give you a bit of 101s or ability to be able to use the PEF based off of where you're at. And so these things are coming in the next couple of months. So please be on the lookout for that, and certainly we'll advertise a lot so that people can go to the new site and be able to engage with it more effectively. The organizations that are interested in piloting, we intend to establish an online community of practice with those organizations so that you can come together and share your learning, share what's working, where your challenges are, what are your frustrations, and how we can support that as well. So we do expect to have a robust community of practice. I imagine this will likely be a lot of your field colleagues who would like to engage, but we'll also look at how we bring in headquarter and technical or regional advisors as well, and what that looks like for different levels that are engaging with the framework. Interaction over the next year as well will support some dedicated workshops, some trainings and support materials around the GBV framework. So these haven't been decided at this point, but we know that there's a lot of interest on outcome mapping or results journals. So that could be a workshop perhaps. And so organizations that are interested in learning a little bit more in depth than they're already getting from the framework within the module, this will be a chance for your teams to join in and to learn and to participate, and then hopefully try to apply the PEF as well as you move forward. On a case-by-case basis as well, Interaction will be able to link on occasion with some of our other work that we do direct support with NGOs on the field. And this is our work really around results-based protection, but obviously the GBV PEF ties in very nicely with this. But there will be some opportunities most likely to do some direct support that we are happy to offer where we can. But one key thing that we've been talking with the steering group with and the advisory committee, and we know that this is going to be extremely important for organizations as they move forward and try to use the PEF, is being able to tap into various experts that know how to use these new methods that we're introducing. So we are pulling together a roster of experts that we hope that would be available to those organizations who are piloting. So if they are interested in doing a context-specific protection analysis, who out there in the world can do that, and where can they go to for advice or support, or who knows about outcome mapping or results journals, and how, and that they understand it from a GBV lens. And so these are the types of experts that we're pulling together that will be able to offer to the wider community to tap into if they're available at various times. As we move forward into the piloting as it goes on, in 2023, Interaction does aim to have an independent review across various contexts where the PEF has been piloted. And this will really give us a chance to see what's working, on where there are real great strengths and evidence coming forward. And then also this will help us document, capture that evidence, and really disseminate that learning very broadly. With basically at the end of all of this in 2024, we expect to do, we'll lead the revision process based off of what the learning comes out of the piloting phase. So hopefully it's a rich 2 years or so for the pilot, with lots of interest in different organizations bringing in their experience and what's working and what's not, so that ultimately we end up with a really strong product, which I imagine will still always be a living document that will evolve over time as well. So with that said, let's go to the very last slide. So just with my last minute here on the webinar, again, we put the link in the chat, but here it is again, so that you can have access to it. You can always contact me. My email is up there as we move forward. But we're very excited about this new phase of the project, thrilled that the GBV framework has now launched. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that's participated in this, our advisory committee, all the 15 organizations that have contributed significantly in the design and their input and feedback, our steering group as well, and especially CETA, who's been able to support us financially, but also promote, results-based approaches and how important this is for the community to start to focus on prevention outcomes for GBV. So it's very exciting. And lastly, I just want to thank our panelists today, our moderator, and mostly as well Data Conscious and your full team, Neil, for pulling this together with us and sticking with us this whole time. It's been a fabulous project and can't wait to see over the next couple of years. So thank you everybody for participating. And I know there's lots more questions, so feel free to send them my way. I think our team is ready and super excited. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to the next phase.